Uh, Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please take your seat because this seminar will be start very soon. Yes, welcome to our seminar on Policy Development Forum. It's a great honor for SMERU to host a seminar in which Professor Gustav Papanek is the speaker. For your information, Professor Papanek is one of our advisor in SMERU, and he is an emeritus professor of economics at Boston University, and also president of Boston Institute for Development Economies. Professor Papanek has been working in Indonesia and with other economists, Indonesian economists, since 1962. So he has gone through different administration with a lot of experience, of course, particularly for the 7th president. Professor Papanek has written a book titled Economic Choices Facing the Next President, together with Dr. Pardede, who is the vice head of National Economic Council, and Professor Suhasil, professor of economics of University of Indonesia. The book is published by Center for Public Policy Transformasi and downloadable from the website. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we know that one of huge tasks for the new government is to create new jobs, productive and decent jobs for increasingly growing labor force. We know that 2 million people are entering the labor force every year. So it's of high relevance to talk about solution to this challenge. I stop at that point and I will allow Professor Papanek to talk about his idea on this context for another 45 minutes. And we are lucky to have an enthusiastic crowd for another discussion session. Professor Papanek, the floor is yours.
I cannot talk for less than 50 minutes. I'm accustomed to that. Now, I think the only graph or table you need is the one that is on the screen right now. You can see it's such an honest face that whatever I say must be true. But there may be some of you, can you hear me in back without the microphone or not? Must be bad acoustics here. I never use a microphone for less than 200 people, and I don't think that you are here. It's more than 200. Bad acoustics. Okay, so this, all right. The impetus for our work comes very much from this chart. It shows what has happened to the income, or rather to the consumption of different income groups in Indonesia. The bottom line is the consumption of the poorest 40%. The top line is the consumption of the richest 20%. You can see in the early days, the consumption of the poorest 40% increased quite well. It's hard to see on this chart, but the next one will show it clearly. But then beginning in 1998 and accelerating in 2005, the gap between the poorest and the richest increased dramatically. This can be seen, yes, this can be seen even more clearly from this graph. In the early days, from 1964-65 to 1984, the income of the poor, or the consumption of the poor, actually, increased more than that of the middle group or the richest group. I don't know, but, well, you have a handout there. The poorest increased 50% in the first period, 92% in the second period, significantly more than that of the wealthiest. But then from 1984 to 1996, the situation reversed, and the rich pulled ahead of the poor by a small amount. But the big difference came from 1996 to 2005 and from 2005 to 2013. During the period of the commodity boom, the consumption of the rich increased more than twice as fast as the consumption of the poorest 40%. Income distribution clearly became less equal during this period. And since this increase in income disparities started in 1996 and was still going on in 2013, the deterioration in income distribution was very significant. It's very clear here when one looks at the consumption of different income groups. I don't think these data have been presented before, but they show a very clear picture of the poor benefiting more than the rich until 1984, then the two about equal, and then the rich benefiting much more than the poor. Why should that be so? I think one can see differences with respect to what happened to exports from Indonesia. In the early period, there was a rapid growth of manufactured exports. Manufactured exports are the very first column here, the blue column. On top is the manufactured exports at current prices, which indicates the income derived by Indonesia. The bottom one shows exports at constant prices, which means the quantity exported. So manufactured exports grew very rapidly in the early periods, but labor-intensive manufactured exports grew even more rapidly. Very hard to talk with two gadgets in each hand. I'm accustomed to talking with my hands, and this is very difficult when I have two gadgets. So look at the remarkable performance of Indonesia with respect to manufactured exports during the first two periods. From 75 to 85, labor-intensive manufactured exports were increasing at 62% per year. That means they doubled almost every year. Indonesia, of course, the base was small. I acknowledge that. The base was small. But the growth rate was fantastic. Indonesia was the champion in Asia. Its exports grew more rapidly than China during this period. And even if you discount the effect of price change, if you look at the quantity change, manufactured exports were growing rapidly, but labor-intensive manufactured exports in the first period were growing at 49%, and in the second period at 32% a year, which means they almost doubled in 2 years. Yeah. Of course, it started at less than $1 billion, but it very quickly went to $23 billion, and it kept on growing. Contrast that with what happened most recently, 96 to 2013, manufactured exports were growing very slowly. Labor-intensive manufactured exports were growing even more slowly, and the quantity of labor-intensive manufactured exports were growing only at 4% a year from 96 to 2013. It's the quantity that matters for employment. So what happened during the commodity boom period was that Indonesia became non-competitive for manufactured exports, and especially for labor-intensive manufactured exports, because the cost of labor increased very rapidly as a result of two factors. Minimum wages shot up, so rupiah wages increased rapidly, and the rupiah appreciated. It appreciated from about 11,700 or 11,500 to 8,500 rupiah to the dollar at the maximum. That's a huge appreciation. It's an appreciation of more than 30%, and therefore wages rose very rapidly for exporters or those competing with imports. And the number of jobs created in manufacturing shrank tremendously. And as a result, the income of lower income groups did not rise significantly. I think this is the basic thesis in our book. The basic thesis is the only way to increase the income of the poorer parts of the population significantly is by creating jobs that enable them to have a higher and more regular income. That is the secret of success for raising the income of the lower income groups. Remember that the first graph, which showed what happened to the consumption of the poor, already includes the effects of all the government programs to benefit the poor. The impact of Ruskin, the impact of any other program that increases the consumption of the poor by subsidizing it was already included in our graph. If people were able to buy more rice because rice was subsidized for them, that was already showing in the consumption of rice and of other foods in the first chart. So government programs are already included there. And yet income distribution became less equal. So our thesis is the way to raise the income of the poor is to provide jobs that have a higher wage and a more regular wage than many poor now receive. This shows wages of different groups of the population. Whenever we have been talking about the importance of increasing manufactured employment in order to improve the lot of the poor, somebody inevitably says, but industrial workers are exploited. Their income is low. It is inadequate to sustain a decent lifestyle. it is exploitative labor. That may be so, but everything depends on your perspective. I used to think that people who are 65 years old are old. I now think that people who are 65 are barely out of adolescence. Their life is still ahead of them. They have most years of productive labor that is still to come. So my perspective has changed. I suppose at one time I thought that people who were 35 are old, but now I consider people who are 90, those are old. So it doesn't apply to me. So it's all depends on your perspective. Yes, industrial workers' wages are not very high. The average is the first graph, the first bar, shows the average wage for industrial workers in Indonesia. It's 1.9 billion rupiah a month. What is that? It's $180 or something like that, 175, depending on the day you're looking at it. So that's not a very high wage. But contrast that with the average wage of agricultural workers. That's only 1 billion rupiah. Million, yes. Well, I'm very generous. I'd like to. So 1 million rupiah a month, yeah? So their income is less than $100 a month. If they move from agriculture to industry, their income almost doubles on average. But equally important, in agriculture, you are not assured of an income every week. You have an income when it's planting time or harvesting time, but in between you may not have this kind of even 1 million rupiah. The last bar is an estimate of the income of urban informal sector occupation. That's one of those estimates that you somehow pull up from the air because it's based on a study that Dr. Jatun Kontroyakti and I did in the 1970s. It's a long time ago, but I cannot find any other data on the income of urban informal sector occupations. So this is taking 1970 data and adjusting it from 1970 to the present. So its accuracy is highly dubious. But anyway, it gives some indication that urban sector informal workers also benefit tremendously when they move to industrial employment. Here comes another controversial part of our paper. We argue that if Indonesia reforms its policies so that it becomes competitive in the world market for manufactured goods, it can achieve a high rate of growth and it can create a large number of good jobs. It can move a substantial part of its labor force from low productivity or no productivity employment in agriculture and informal sector occupations to higher productivity, higher income jobs in manufacturing and other formal sector occupations. With reforms, without reforms, Indonesia will continue to create as many jobs in the future as it has in the recent past, which is about 1 million jobs a year, a little bit more than 1 million jobs a year. But 2 million people are entering the labor force. So not enough jobs even for the people who are entering the labor force. 6 million jobs in 5 years. With reforms, 21 million jobs, actually to be exact, 1.8 million. But these forecasts, the accuracy of these forecasts to 1 decimal point is, to my mind, always dubious. And I love people who put in 2 decimal points as though they really knew what exactly was going to happen. So I rounded off to the nearest whole, 21 million jobs. It's even better once you project this for 10 years, because once you project high growth for 10 years, the economy is totally transformed. So without reforms, 11 million jobs. You keep on producing 1 million jobs a year, yeah, a little bit more. With reforms, 77 million new productive good jobs. Well, the labor force 10 years from now will be about 130 million. So 77 new million good jobs. Everybody would have a good job. Now we do the same thing for per capita national income. These numbers should be percentages, or they are percentages. So 19 means 19%. Without reform, 19% increase in per capita income. With reform, 36% in the first 5 years, and 105% or doubling in the second 5 years. We're assuming that if the government does these things, if it creates this many jobs, the president will be re-elected and will continue the policies. How is it possible that Indonesia can achieve such a great increase in per capita income and such a large number of jobs? There are 2 factors that make it possible for Indonesia to do this. The first one is that China, which has been dominating the world market for labor-intensive goods for 30 years, is no longer competitive in these goods. The Chinese labor force is shrinking. The Indonesian labor force is increasing. The Chinese labor force shrinking means that wages are rising very rapidly and labor costs are rising even more rapidly. China exports of manufactured goods have been $2,000 billion per year, growing at about $150 billion a year. That is, the growth in Chinese manufactured exports, the increase every year is larger than Indonesia's total manufactured exports. China has dominated the world market, and of this $2,000 billion worth of exports, about 1,500 billion is labor intensive. I have a wonderful table which lists every one of these labor intensive exports over the last 3 years. It shows how it has been increasing. And it divides all of Chinese exports into labor intensive and non-labor intensive on the assumption that Indonesia can take over the labor intensive ones, not the non-labor intensive ones. So there are $1,500 billion worth of Chinese exports of labor intensive manufactured goods. If Indonesia can capture 7% of that, and that's 7% of the exports for 2012, which are increasing every year by about 10%. If Indonesia can capture 7% of Chinese labor-intensive exports, it will increase its exports by $110 billion. So what Indonesia must do is get its share of the labor-intensive exports that China used to produce. So the one factor is that China is moving out of this production. Other countries are increasingly producing these labor-intensive goods. The other factor that makes it possible for Indonesia to be competitive is that it has a substantial amount of surplus labor. This is also very controversial, and I'm sure some of you will disagree with it. What do I mean by surplus labor? I mean workers whose productivity, whose marginal product in economic terms, is low or zero. They work hard, they work many hours in some cases, but their contribution to output is small. How is that possible? Well, there used to be two people shining shoes at the intersection, then there were three people, and finally now there are four people shining shoes. As many shoes are being shined as before, but it's divided among four people instead of among two people. The marginal product of the final two people may be zero. They're not adding to the number of shoes shined. They are just getting a small share of the income that is produced in shoe shining on that corner. The biggest example of surplus labor is in agriculture, and that is the one area in which there are some statistics that can perhaps persuade you. The top line shows employment in agriculture. It shows the change in the number of workers per year. If you look at the first period from 1986-89 to 1991-97, on average, 330,000 workers left agriculture every year. That's typical of a developing, successfully developing country. Workers leave agriculture and join industry and other formal sector occupations. And thereby, they increase the productivity in agriculture per worker. Actually, if you look at 88, 89 to 95, 97, 750,000 workers left agriculture every year during that period. But now, in contrast, look at what has happened since 1995-97. The number of workers in agriculture increased. Instead of decreasing, it increased by 240,000 a year. What does that tell you? It tells you that these workers were joining agriculture, or actually staying in agriculture, because they could not find other jobs. To me, it shows they were not needed in agriculture, but they could not find another job. What is the evidence? The increase in value added in agriculture in the first two periods was more than 4%. The number of workers was decreasing. Output was increasing. The output per worker was increasing more because you had fewer workers, greater output. Output was increasing despite the fact that workers were leaving agriculture. These workers were not needed. You were able to increase output even though they left agriculture. In the most recent period, output continued to increase, but at a lower percentage rate. If the workers were really needed, when you increase the number of workers, you would increase the rate of growth of value added, but that's not what happened. The explanation lies in the bottom. The increase in manufacturing jobs. In the first two periods, there were manufacturing jobs were increasing at a rapid rate, 500,000 per year or 600,000 per year. So people left agriculture, found jobs in manufacturing, and that is the process of economic development in its essence. But since Chris Mon, not many jobs have been created in manufacturing. Only 300,000 a year, or less than 300,000 a year. People could not find jobs in manufacturing. They could not find jobs in construction. They could not find jobs in transportation and communication and so on. So what did they do? They stayed on the family plot and worked there even though they were not needed, even though their marginal product was zero. So this is the best evidence I have for this argument that there is surplus labor. There's also anecdotal evidence. I mean, you can go, what strikes me is that even during rush hour, there are OCHECs that are standing idle. That is, to me, an example of surplus labor. All right. What should be done for Indonesia to become competitive? That's the final point I would like to make. How can Indonesia, again, compete in the world market for manufactured goods and therefore employ more workers in manufacturing and therefore improve the income of the poor? Well, it needs to lower its costs. Indonesia is not competitive because its costs are too high. One way of lowering costs is to improve infrastructure. Now, if I say Indonesia must improve infrastructure, I'm repeating what consultants have said for 25 years. So it's not very useful or profound. Okay? For at least 25 years, people have said Indonesia must improve its infrastructure. I think it's probably longer. And nothing has happened to dramatically improve the infrastructure. Why? Well, number one, don't have, we do not. Number one, the government have infrastructure. As long as you have money to invest, any talk of improving infrastructure is just idle talk. You cannot create infrastructure with goodwill. You need to create it with funds. And Raden Pardede has made an estimate of the actual investment that is taking place on the part of the national government in infrastructure, and his estimate is less than 1%. You cannot compete in the world with a 1% investment in infrastructure. So we need to go from 1% to 5 or 6%. In the first year, the only way to get the resources to increase investment in infrastructure is by reducing the fuel subsidy. We think over 2 years or 3 years, you can get 1.5% of GDP out of that. In the second and third and fourth year, you can get more resources from tax reform. And we have various suggestions for tax reforms that should yield about 3.5% of GDP. Now, most of these recommendations don't ask for higher rates. They ask for extension of the coverage and for better collection. Clearly, one of the steps that needs to be taken is it needs to be established that everybody pays taxes, even if they are nice people and powerful, or nice people and not so powerful, or not so nice, powerful people and not so nice, who don't think they should pay taxes just because it's who they are. So we think you can get about 3.5% from tax reform, 1.5% from reducing subsidies, to a total 5%. Once you have 5%, you're in business, but you're in small business. You need more than 5% to make up all the deficit that has occurred in the past. And so you're going to need in private investment to come in as well. And here the fashionable thing has been private-public partnership, and we've heard about that for several years, and this had no impact whatsoever. And we're suggesting again that Indonesia use production sharing approach to infrastructure investment. After all, production sharing has been invented in Indonesia, so it must be a good thing. And it's much easier for people to accept because it is Indonesian invented. So it can be applied to the creation of power stations, ports, airports, and so on. That's so much for infrastructure. That's one area of cost that can be reduced substantially. Second area of cost that needs to be reduced is the cost of labor. But we do not want to propose going back to the good old days when Indonesia competed by exploiting labor. You know, I don't know how many of you know the story of the Minister of Trade who was asked to increase exports substantially, and the minister by threefold, and the minister said that is impossible. And the minister was asked by the vice president, why is it impossible? And the minister said, because Indonesia has a poor infrastructure, and Indonesia has very bad labor regulation, and it has corruption, and I have no control over these matters. I cannot increase exports unless the ministers that deal with these other matters cooperate. And the vice president shook his head and said, that is no excuse. We have always had poor labor legislation. We have always had corruption. We have always had bad infrastructure, and we used to export wonderfully well. So don't give me this argument that you can't do it because of these other factors. What the Minister of Trade hadn't said is that Indonesia used to compete by squeezing labor. And you could do that when you could prohibit unions and strikes, and the trade unions were really government agencies that designed to keep wages low and labor suppressed. Now you cannot do that. You cannot go back to the, depending on your perspective, good old days or bad old days. You cannot anymore compete by suppressing labor. You now have to deal with all of the other cost factors. So, but you have to lower the cost of labor to the exporter, while at the same time increasing the income of workers. And non-economists shake their head and said, that's impossible. You cannot at the same time increase the cost of income, the income of workers, and reduce the cost of labor. But we economists, we're smart. We know how you can do that, right? By the exchange rate. Because the exporter does not care how many rupiah he pays. He cares how many dollars or yen he pays, and that depends on the exchange rate. So one of our recommendations is a gradual decline in the value of the rupiah. This has two problems. First of all, most people in power in Indonesia think if the value of the rupiah declines, it's a sign of failure. If the value of the rupiah rises, it's a sign of success. I would like every economist in Indonesia to keep repeating every time they have a chance, strong rupiah, weak economy. Strong rupiah, weak economy, until the political leadership says, oh, maybe strong rupiah, weak economy. Not strong rupiah, strong economy. No, strong rupiah, not success, failure. So that is one problem, persuading people that a weak rupiah is a sign of success. And what you need to do is what Chinese have done. You say the evil imperialist Americans and British and Europeans, they want us to push up the value of the rupiah so we cannot compete. But we're strong, we're independent, we do what is in our interest, not what's in their interest. We're going to have a weak rupiah so we can compete on the world market, and we will take away the market from them. So that's one problem. The other problem, of course, is a real problem, which is that it causes an increase in inflation. And here our argument is inflation is not bad as long as it hits mostly the consumption of luxury goods. We want to reduce the import of luxury goods into Indonesia in order to balance the trade account. But if it hits the food of lower income groups, it is not desirable. So we need to stabilize the food of lower income groups. With respect to rice, which is the most important of these foods, it has been relatively easy to do that because Indonesian prices are above world market prices. So then we have a whole host of other recommendations. For instance, severance pay is costly to the enterprises that are law-abiding and costless to the enterprises that are not law-abiding, and therefore provides almost no benefits to workers and a cost to employers. You would think you could find a better system that benefits workers more and employers costs less. But you cannot do it by forcing it on workers. So you need to do it by a voluntary system that we recommend. I just want to point to the last table to justify what our recommendations provide. This shows what happened before Krismon and after with respect to the real consumption of the poorest 40%. It's the same data as in the first graph. And you can see from 84 to 96, the real consumption almost doubled. From 2002 to 2007, it's of course a shorter period of time. The increase was much smaller and even smaller per year. During the first period, the export of manufactured products increased very sharply. During the second period, hardly at all. The exchange rate during the first period depreciated by 50%, or was cut in half. During the second period, it appreciated. The appreciating exchange rate contributed to slower growth of manufactured exports, to slower growth of employment, to slower growth in the income of the poor. And as a result, the appreciation of the exchange rate meant more poverty. There are many more data that we have assembled, particularly to justify the high rate of growth that we are projecting. I'm not going to talk about this, but I just want to show you. This is the table on which the growth rate of Indonesia is based. It shows the impact of $110 billion worth of increased exports on national income. This is the direct effect. Then you have an indirect effect through the multiplier, which in Indonesia we estimate at 1.95, so that for every rupiah increase directly, there's almost another rupiah increase indirectly. And then we go on. This is just the export side. Then there's the import substitution side. And then there are things other than manufacturing. And all of this has been, oh, I thought there was another chart, but there isn't. All of this has been put together to estimate the increase in income, and from that, the increase in employment. So it may be wrong, but it certainly is based on a lot of work and a lot of data that has been assembled for the first time. And the 110 billion is the 7% of Chinese labor-intensive manufactured exports that we think realistically Indonesia can capture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Papanek. I forgot to tell you that you look great in your batik shirt. And we are all are very happy here because we have barely adolescent presenter and very young moderator. Okay, I jot down here some important technology, 21 million goods and productive jobs, double-digit growth, surplus of labor, lower cost of production, improved infrastructure, reduced cost of labor, all those terms that you can explore from Professor Papanek. I will open the first session of 3 questions from you. Please raise your hand and mention your affiliation or name and affiliation. Yes, Pak, Ibu, and Pak Tri.
Thank you guys for excellent presentations, and most importantly, for make me feeling younger. Yeah. Excellent as usual. I think I subscribe the key message that you presented. I think I just have a couple of comments, perhaps. The first one, I guess, is just to restate the reform that you mentioned. I think if you look at the reform that happened in the last 10 years, I think a lot of the reform, particularly structural reform, was implemented in reactive way. I think it's not something that happened because we have a vision of creating job 20 million in 5 years or so on. Yeah. It is always coming as a reactions to something. When things doesn't happen, then we react with reform. I think what reform you mean here, I guess, reform that is transformative to the economy. It's not just reactive reform. I think it's very important to highlight from your presentations. And second point is about the thing. I agree with the key message. I think exchange rate has to be there to help the economy to be more competitive. In fact, I think with recent development, I think you already got exchange rates close to your assumptions, so to 12,500. I think, but at the same time, obviously, I think it has to be balanced with the reform. It has to be balanced with, well, exchange rate can give us initially a jump start to competitiveness, but along the way, competitiveness needs to come also from improvement of our productivity and so on, as you mentioned, to reform. Yeah, I think it has to come in both ways. I think I also like to mention a country like Australia, where exchange rate is really driven by short-term fundamental in the market, and as a result, they basically think that resource boom will continue to stay forever, and as a result, many of the manufacturing sector are actually closing down because exchange rate become too high. Obviously, that's not the exchange rate everyone. Exchange rate will be adjusting to the medium-term fundamental of the country, including the the development of manufacturing. Thank you.
I suppose we will have a lot of question and answers, so
I'll try to be brief.
oh, okay. Okay, then I will allow Professor Papanek to answer the first question.
I think, I am going to present this to non-economists. I will also present the bad alternative. If you don't do this, you will not be employing the people joining the labor force. You will have more underemployed workers. You will drive more people abroad, and that is not a popular situation. On the contrary, if you manage to create 21 million good jobs before the next election, you'll probably be re-elected in a landslide. So there is some political attractiveness to these two alternatives. And I'm going to say that if no changes are made in policy, Indonesia will not grow at 7% or 6%, but at 5% at best. And the number of jobs created will only be 1%. So I will present the negative as well. Absolutely, there are a variety of ways in which Indonesia can improve labor productivity. And in fact, it doesn't need to do very much, because Indonesia is not competing with heaven. It's competing with Bangladesh. That's not heaven. The situation, the infrastructure in Bangladesh is a shambles. There are 300 political strikes every 2 years, or 150 strikes a year. That's almost every other day. That's not industrial strikes. That's political strikes called by the party out of power. Now that must reduce labor productivity because people are not working on those days in at least some of the factories. Yeah. So you're not competing with perfection. You're competing with countries that have problems of their own that are huge. So some small improvements here can make a big difference. Yeah. But there were 2 shoe factories set up in Bangladesh in the last year, each of them employing 70,000 workers. That's 140,000 workers in 2 factories. Why didn't they come here? Because of uncertainty about the attitude towards foreign investment, and because of lower costs in Bangladesh. They could have come here, but they didn't. If they had come here, they would have created 140,000 jobs by themselves directly, and probably another 140,000 indirectly. That's a big loss.
Thank you, Papakas. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about the potential for the food production sector and whether you thought that was an opportunity for labor-intensive manufacturing in Indonesia. I noted that it wasn't in the list that you provided at the end there, and whether you think there's potential. If you do, would that be possible in the next 5 years, or is it more likely in the second 5 years? Thanks. Or not at all, and why? Thank you.
I think the Indonesian problem of creating enough good jobs is so big that Indonesia needs to do whatever it can in whatever fields it can to create income. And that includes tourism. It includes cash crop agriculture. It includes food crop agriculture. It includes mining. It includes oil and gas production. And it includes a whole host of other things. I think there's substantial potential in agriculture, but that cannot be what is driving the economy for two reasons. First of all, you already have surplus labor, so you cannot employ more people there. You can increase output with the same number of people, or preferably increase output with fewer people. Secondly, the maximum growth rate of the agriculture sector that has been achieved anywhere is around 4%. So you can go from 3% to 4%, maybe 4.5%. You cannot go to 20% in agriculture. Nobody's ever done that. Nobody. So that cannot be the sector driving the economy. Neither can tourism. These are all sectors that can contribute, and we have a small provision in our forecasts for what all of these other sectors will do. But the central focus has to be manufacturing. And a government can, most governments, well, no government, all governments can focus on one objective quite well. Once you have 5 objectives, nothing will get done, because everybody will say this is a priority, and it's going to be very difficult to focus on doing the things that you need to do to increase manufacturing production for export. So that's why we stress that. That's why we emphasize this one sector. Not because there's nothing to be done in other sectors, because that is the one that is going to drive growth.
Thank you, Vargas, for a very intriguing presentation. Can we go back to the slide number 2 or 3 on the percentage change in exports? If I may. Yeah, the percentage change in exports doesn't say here what that is. This one, yeah. This one is very interesting, especially, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about why, and in terms of why the difference between the 75 to 85 with very high labor-intensive manufacturing exports compared to the ones that is very low, and in fact, very low compared to minus in that sense. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more, in addition to perhaps the different kinds of monetary and fiscal policies? What are the specific policies that the governments made? Or were there kind of some policies that were, more enabling policies that will make these things, a stark difference there happen?
75, with 1996, for instance?
Yes.
Yeah,
Correct. Thank you.
yeah. That's an interesting story. In 85, 86, 87, Indonesia devalued the currency by 50%. It at the same time freed up imports that are needed to produce exports, and it facilitated foreign investment. 3 things were done at the same time. The biggest one was the devaluation. There were 3 devaluations that together totaled 50%. You remember the exchange rate was 1,000 to the dollar, and then it was 2,300, 2,400, eventually 2,500 to the US dollar. That all happened in a very short period of time. It was a partially compensated devaluation. The prices of foods were stabilized to some degree. The government had much more control over these matters at that time than it does now. And it was able to stabilize especially the price of rice, which was, and of wheat. The price of rice was almost completely under the control of Bullock. The price of wheat was, again, almost completely under the control of the government because it was imported for free under PL 480 from the United States, and the government could decide at what price to sell it. The price at which it sold the wheat determined how much income the government derived from selling wheat that it got from the United States for free, essentially. Well, it was a loan that was to be paid off in the future. So the government could determine the wheat price. Those of you who were around at that time remember that there was a commission to be made on the import, which went to the First Lady. And that's why she was known as Madame 10%, because she was a very modest person and she only asked for 10%. If that had remained the commission for the rest of the tenure of the government, they might still be in power. But the commission became larger and larger, and that caused problems. But so the price of wheat could be stabilized, the price of rice was stabilized, and they managed to keep inflation under very strict control, but despite the devaluation of 50%. And that caused that huge boom in labor-intensive exports between 1985, 86, and 1992. Beginning in 1992, the government allowed inflation to rise more rapidly than devaluation. And the real exchange rate appreciated, which made the impact of the 98 financial crisis worse. And of course, from then on, after that, wages began to rise rapidly, and then the rupiah appreciated, and the combination was devastating to export.
Thank you, guys. Just one quick clarification. So are you saying that we can all achieve this without having to do a reform of the labor regulations?
No, as I mentioned, I thought the severance pay could be reformed. I don't know whether I'm right on this, but I think it can be reformed because it's really not benefiting workers much in reality, yes? Because many of the firms that are going out of business and would have to pay severance pay don't do so. They borrow whatever they can on their assets. They sell whatever assets they can, and then the owners disappear. And they tell the bank, I mean, they don't tell the bank anything because they're gone. But the bank is left with a greatly depreciated asset if they can manage that. they lose very little. They don't pay severance pay, and they have gone off to some other country where they cannot be caught. The workers end up without severance pay or partial severance pay. They demonstrate to get more from the government, but it's not a problem of the firm. So I think severance pay needs to be reformed and should be possible to reform it on a voluntary basis. Other regulations.
Minimum wage? How about the minimum wage?
I think the minimum wage in Jakarta now at $200 makes the Jabotabek area uncompetitive for labor-intensive manufacturing. My guess is that there will be little new investment in labor-intensive manufacturing in the Jakarta area. What is happening here is that industries that are labor-intensive are becoming less labor-intensive. I interviewed one shoe factory when I was here in March. He had reduced his labor force by 15%. He was producing shoes in Jakarta. He didn't want to leave Jakarta because he didn't want to leave. The owner did not want to leave Jakarta, and he wanted to be near his factory. He didn't like going somewhere else in Indonesia, so he decided to stay here, and he decided he could manage here by reducing his labor force, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, yeah? More jobs. So he was paying off workers, he was retiring. As they were retiring, he wasn't replacing them. He reduced his labor force by 15% in 1 year, and that way he thought he could be competitive. But new factories will not establish themselves in Jakarta as long as the wage here is $200. Now, the wage in China for garment workers, I'm always trying to compare garment workers so that you're comparing like and like. Yeah, you can't compare garment workers with steel workers and get a correct answer. The wage for garment workers in China inland is $330, and on the coast it's $400. So it's still much higher than in Indonesia. Yeah. So Indonesia can compete with China, no problem. The problem is competing with Bangladesh. But the Bangladeshis have been very nice. They like Indonesians, and so they raised the minimum wage from $38 to $68. That made a huge difference in the competitive position. The minimum wage in Central Java, on average now, is $84. In Bangladesh, it's $69. That's a gap of only $16, or a gap of what, of 20%, roughly, a little bit more than 20% above the Bangladeshi wage. That's not a big gap. So I think Central Java will be the place where labor-intensive industries will locate if the infrastructure there can be improved. So one of our recommendations was priority in investment in infrastructure must go to those areas that have attracted investment in exports industries. So it should go, first of all, to the Semarang area. And that area should be able to compete with a small improvement, with an improvement in infrastructure and some other small improvement, because the gap between it and Bangladesh is very small. And Bangladesh infrastructure is much worse than Indonesia. I mean, Dhaka is Jakarta, but no toll roads, no what are they called? The flyovers, yes. No bridges, no new construction, essentially, in the last 20 years. And For 10 years, they did not invest in increasing the power supply. The demand doubled, the supply did not increase by 1 kilowatt. You ought to be able to compete with a country like that. Wages are lower, yes, but everything else is not as good. And the political situation, the political risk is very much bigger because the two parties hate each other. And the heads of each of the two parties are convinced that the family of the other party assassinated the father or the husband of the leader of that party. And they're right. They both are right that they assassinated each other. So it's very hard to work together. That's why you have these political strikes. Because when one party is in power, the other party wants to make life as difficult as possible. Now, that hasn't yet happened here. And I hope it doesn't.
Thank you very much, guys. But your reference for Indonesian competitors, Bangladesh, of course, we are to some extent ahead of. But how about others, especially Thailand or probably Vietnam? I don't know so much about the Philippines. Well, I think I'd like to listen to that, your exploration. And back to agriculture sectors. Colleague, especially Suhasil, when launching the book, I think a few weeks ago, was very promising. There are a lot of opportunity in especially rural area, although the solution seems to me as a bit ad hoc, padat karya, kerja, and so on and so on. But back to the ladies on food industry. Some data show us, well, even for food industry, the import content is, the thing is, you know, domestically of agricultural food material is not enough for, you know, supporting agriculture, food industry. So I think, well, even in that sector, we are importing a lot. And that's back to exchange rate. That's going to be a common issues that if we appreciate it, the exchange rate or the import content, or of course, to reducing the current account is, you know, kind of not in that line, but depreciating to some extent hit also the, you know, especially raw material and even capital goods for pushing our manufacturing industry. So, but of course, Bank Indonesia as well is a bit, you know, you are very correct. There is kind of yeah, appreciating the rupiah means our rupiah store, and then a kind of good perception for government. But I agree with you, probably for the export sectors, on the contrary. Actually, I'd like to promote other sides of Java for the manufacturing sector, but you already mentioned, well, even in Java, there's still room, big room. Yeah, you are mentioning correctly on Semarang. Now people move there, but can you give assessment as well, other cities, especially out of Java? I don't know whether Medan, Makassar, others. Thank you very much.
Whole host of questions. The countries that Indonesia competes with are the countries that have also large pools of labor. If you're going to be competing in labor-intensive industries, you need large pools of relatively low-cost labor. What are these countries? Besides Bangladesh, they're Vietnam and India. Now, India was not much of a competitor because of labor regulations and labor union power and hostility to foreign investment. This may now change with the new president. So India is going to be a more formidable competitor to Indonesia in the future than it has been in the past. These are the three countries that Indonesia competes with. And we have a graph in the book which shows exports from Indonesia and Vietnam, and they go along together like this, and then Vietnam goes this way and Indonesia goes this way. And the increase in Vietnam was again in part because it was more welcoming to foreign investment. It devalued the currency continuously in order to keep wages stable in dollars as they rose in dong. And it managed its economy in order to generate more and more exports. And Indonesia did not do so. So in the last 10 years, the 15 years, the two have come apart. Vietnam now is in serious trouble because, like China, its banking system is full of non-performing loans to state-owned enterprises. So Indonesia has a chance to overtake Vietnam now and to get some of the investment to come here. Now I can't think. Oh, other locations. Yes, there are other locations in Indonesia where labor costs are still low. Labor-intensive manufacturing is not going to go to Makassar or Ujung Pandang because labor costs are high. It's a very successful part of the Indonesian economy, exporting cash crops. Okay, so the labor-intensive industries will want to go, should go to places that where labor costs are low because they do not have a lot of raw materials exports. Yeah. So now there are some parts of Indonesia where labor costs are extremely low, where people would be very happy with the location of industry, NTT and NTB, but the logistics is hopeless. And so what can you do for parts of like that? Well, probably the best thing you can do is provide good education so when they go elsewhere, they can get better jobs, because good jobs will not come there. They will have to leave to get good jobs. So those are the areas that are also very poor, but no potential for industrial development. But there's some parts of East Java, and there are even some parts of West Java, although very small parts, where there might be some potential for industrial development. But you need to start somewhere, and the place to start is Central Java, because wages are low there. There's a large pool of labor. There are a lot of poor people for whom an industrial job at 1.9 million rupiah a month would be just wonderful. So
thank you. My name is Ahmad Shauki. I'm from IPEC. Thanks for the excellent presentation, guys. I just wanted to ask one thing about manufacturing. If you look at the statistics for medium and large scale enterprises in last 12 years, since after the financial crisis, you would see very interesting statistics. The output of medium and large scales are increasing, but the labor or the employment rather is trending down. But at the same time, the number of establishments has also came down. So what this suggests to me is that the size of the firms has increases, but they're using less labor, so they're becoming more capital intensive. One of the reasons, as you have suggested, is probably because of labor issues. But could it also be that Indonesia is moving away from a labor rich country, moving toward a relatively rich capital? So the relative price of capital has actually declined in the last 12 years. And this has a very important implication, I suppose, on your recommendations about where Indonesia should be focusing. If you look at the competitiveness of Indonesia on many of these labor-intensive goods in the last 10 years, measuring their comparative advantage using, for example, RCA, you would see Indonesia is still very competitive in these products, but the level of competitiveness, if you like, has declined on garment, for example, on footwears, on a lot of the food products. On the other hand, you see that the comparative advantage of Indonesia on products like automobiles and electronics are still very low. It's not competitive. It doesn't have a comparative advantage yet, but it's increasing. So it does suggest that Indonesia is moving away from labor intensive. So the question is then, are we or should we be focusing on industries and competing with countries like Bangladesh or Myanmar or Cambodia, or should we be focusing on industries where we are competing with Malaysia, Thailand, South Africa, Brazil, because the issues are very much different. You said that for labor intensive, the issues are labor, but with the more capital intensive, the issues would be things like services, global value change, and things that relate to these issues. So I just want to get your comments on this. Thank you.
You and Vice President have very common views. The Vice President thinks Indonesia should not be competing with Bangladesh and countries like that. Indonesia should be more upstream in the higher technology, more higher value added industries, and not try to compete in the technology, labor intensive industries. Leave that to Bangladesh, to Myanmar, and so on. Okay. First of all, of course, what we have said, do everything, right? Attack wherever you can. Gain jobs and income wherever you can. So Indonesia is now part of the production chain of some automobile companies. That has created jobs in parts production for automobiles here in Indonesia, which are good jobs, well paid, sort of halfway up the technology ladder, and they're fine. But please remember, there are 53 million workers in Indonesia whose highest education is that they have finished primary school. There are 20 million of those 53 million who have not even finished primary school. Either they have no schooling at all, that's about 5 million, and there are 15 million who have entered but not completed primary education. And then there are 30 million who have completed primary education but gone no higher. Now, if you are not going to have low technology, labor intensive industries, what will happen to these 50 million workers whose highest education is primary school completion? Will be very difficult for them to have jobs in industries that require an ability to read blueprints or to be trained on machinery that changes over time. You're just going to abandon those 50 million? By the way, I asked the same, you have the same argument in Bangladesh. Quite interesting. They also have some people who believe that they should be doing high upper technology industries. And I said, what will you do with the large group of people who don't have much education? And he said, we'll ship them all abroad. Now that would be a solution for Indonesia too. Yeah, you can tell these people, well, we don't have jobs for you here, so go get jobs somewhere else. What kind of jobs? Well, they'll get laborers' jobs if they're men, and housemaids' jobs if they're women. And so now there are 6 million Indonesians abroad, and then there'll be 40 million abroad, and that'll solve the problem. I don't think that that's a very realistic solution. And nor is it a very decent solution. Yeah? These jobs abroad, in many cases, are not nice jobs. So that would not be, to my mind, a successful Jokowi administration, if that's what it did. So you need to have jobs for these 53 million workers whose highest education is primary schooling. Then there are another 20 million whose highest education is lower middle school. I don't know which kind of jobs they're qualified for, but they're somewhere in between. So you have 3/4, 2/3 of your labor force that have limited education. And those are the poor people. The people who've completed high school or higher education are generally not poor people. So it's for these 70 million workers that you need to develop labor-intensive manufacturing good production. Now, we recommend a ramping up of schooling for workers who are already on the job, so that over time you can increase the education of the labor force. And in any case, the education of labor force is going to increase anyway, because you no longer have people who have no education, right? I mean, all the younger generation have more than primary education. So gradually the average will move up, the industries will move up, the value added will increase, everything will be wonderful. You just need to get over the next 10 years when you still have this large pool of people who lack education.
Thank you. Just a short comment. Infrastructure development for labor-intensive industries is a good idea, but then the story must be all about Java. Then at the same time, we have to think also about regional equality. And those living outside Java is, we still have a lot of problems there. Then your recommendation is again to increase the education level of people living outside Java. But then the story, it's about migration. Then those living outside of Java go to Java because the jobs there in Java. Then this is probably good in the perspective of economics, but then it is politically incorrect. Again, because we are now running decentralization, at the same time this is our dream for years, that we need more equal development, not only in Java but also outside of Java. Thank you.
I should have said, I mean, there are parts of islands other than Java where there's a large pool of labor protest. So I'm thinking of Lampung. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. There are areas outside. There are two kinds of areas outside of Java. There's some that are doing very, very well. They don't want industrial jobs. North Sulawesi, parts of Kalimantan. I mean, the labor costs there are twice, 3 times what they are in Central Java. Yeah? But there are other areas, including in Papua, who are very poor. How to establish industry in Papua is another matter, but in Lampung, it's a possibility. Even some parts of Kalimantan. Our recommendation is not to discriminate against any particular area of the country. It is to focus in those areas where the greatest poverty is, where the lowest wages are because of the greatest poverty, and where there's some potential in the next 5 years of establishing manufacturing that can compete on the world market. There are some parts of Papua where it's very difficult to come up with any kind of recommendation except to improve the educational system. There's no possibility of having an infrastructure that would support manufacturing. And beyond improving education, and maybe some areas have a potential for tourism, I don't really know what to recommend. I mean, I have answers to many questions, but not to all. My father used to say that God and I, we know everything. The same thing I can say, but that means there are lots of things that I don't know about. So I don't have answers to all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Sono Sarosa from the Partnership for Governance Reform. I have one question. What is your suggested policies with regard to urbanization? As you may be aware that the data that was released by the World Bank recently shows that 1% additional of urban level in Indonesia contribute less to the additional of GDP compared to those in China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So urbanization contribution to the increase of GDP is much less in Indonesia than in our neighboring countries. And on the other hand, or perhaps that's also related to the opinions of the decision makers that often see urbanization as something that needs to be avoided or something bad. And those opinions clearly showed during the campaign, and also if you look at the policy platforms of both sides of the competitors. What do you think of the, or what is your suggested policies with regard to urbanization? Thank you.
With respect to urbanization, that's one of the subjects where my knowledge is limited. So I have to say more than I know. Indonesian productivity is, as measured in a variety of ways, is usually lower than in some other countries. Okay? But if you believe, as I do, that Indonesia has large numbers of surplus workers whose marginal product is zero or close to zero, you inevitably get that, because when you do any average, if there are 20 million workers whose marginal product is close to zero, the average product will also be lower than in other countries which don't have such a large number of surplus workers. I believe Indonesia has had surplus workers for a long, long time. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz wrote about agricultural involution. That's nothing but surplus labor. It's the same idea. And he was writing about the Dutch times. Yeah. Now, I think surplus labor has increased since 1998. And I'm only looking at the increase that occurred since 1998, but there probably was substantial surplus labor even in 1998 and even in 1926. I've looked at wages in Indonesia over a long period of time, and the wages in 1926 were as high as they were 30 years later, because 1926 was before the Great Depression. Indonesia suffered during the Great Depression. It suffered during the Japanese occupation. It suffered during the freedom struggle, which destroyed property. It suffered from the nationalization of the plantations. So there have been factors that have resulted in a downhill slide for the economy since the 1920s. There's been an improvement also at the same time, industrial development. So you're back somewhere in the 1970s, 80s. You were back up to where you were in the 1920s. But as far as the poor parts of the population are concerned, they have not done well in the last 10 years. Their income has increased very little. And there's one more slide, which I'll put back in, which we somehow lost, which shows that wages of agricultural laborers have declined since 2008 to the present time by about 11%. Now, that is a period during which Indonesian growth was 6% a year for several years, which means per capita 4.5%. So the average person was much better off. The agricultural workers were worse off. What does that mean about income distribution? That's not really your question, but it's not surprising that productivity on average is lower because you have this large group of people whose productivity is close to zero or zero. If you have 4 shoe shiners, when 2 can shine the shoes just as well, the marginal product of the last 2 is zero. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. As you comment, we have to create job for about 50 million workforce in order to double our economic growth. In this regard, I think we have to develop labor-intensive manufacturing industry. My question is, what kind of manufacturing industry which is competitive and viable in terms of availability of raw materials, market, and also labor cost and also labor politics? Thank you.
Viable. Um, I don't think it matters whether, for my purposes, whether the raw materials of an industry are imported or domestically produced. What matters is the value added and the labor intensity. That is, to what proportion of the total cost is labor costs. The textile industry, the garment industry are entirely based on imported raw materials. Yeah. So with devaluation, the cost of raw material inputs goes up, but it doesn't matter because the value of the goods produced also goes up. So the amount available to pay for value added to the workers plus profit increases. So I don't care about the raw material component, although if it's a domestic raw material component, it adds to employment in Indonesia. Yeah, because if you are expanding the production of palm oil, jobs both in the palm oil industry and in land clearing and in housing for palm oil workers and so on, although these are not good jobs. So that doesn't matter. I think the only thing that matters is the cost of labor, because at the very high cost of labor, it's difficult to compete in labor-intensive industries. Yeah? I think will continue to be of more capital-intensive industries, of industries produced for the domestic market and tariff barriers, of established firms that have already made the investment decision and that will increase their labor decrease their labor intensity and stay here. So Jakarta will continue to grow as a manufacturing center for non-labor intensive industries. The labor intensive industries will move elsewhere where labor costs are reasonable and where there is a government that welcomes them and that uses its resources to improve the infrastructure and lower the costs. One of our major recommendations, which I haven't mentioned, is that once the national government has some resources, it should use some of these resources to do what any government in a decentralized, any national government in a decentralized system can do to get the below national government units to do what the national government wants, which is to provide matching grants. You know, in the United States, the power to set the speed limit for automobiles is entirely in the hands of the states. The national government has no authority, but all states have a speed limit of 65 miles an hour. Why? If they have another speed limit, the national government does not pay for building roads in the state. So the states that don't believe in the speed limit of 65 miles an hour still adopt it, but don't enforce it. So in Colorado, you know that the speed limit is 65 because they have to do that in order to get money for their roads from the national government. But if you drive below 75, the police will not stop you because they don't enforce it. So that is how, I think the same thing is true in Australia, which is also a decentralized system. Here, it doesn't work because the national government has no money at the present time. So they cannot offer matching grants. But once they have funds for infrastructure, some of that money should go to provinces, kabupaten, kecamatan, that use some of their money to build infrastructure instead of using all their money to pay for offices and government perks and salaries. So there'll be an incentive system so that if you put some of your money into roads, the national government will give you some money also for roads. You need a matching grant system too, but that's not really the question you asked. So I'm sorry. I got off the subject and I've forgotten what the question was.
No problem. Still important.
But you want to remind me what the question was? Oh, okay. Okay. I think, you know, I think it's any one of these that are labor intensive. Now, at the moment, Indonesia has really only developed 4 industries that are labor intensive. Yeah. That's garments, textiles, shoes, and furniture. But the amounts of toys produced here, construction materials, kitchenware, it's all still quite small. And which it will expand, I don't know, because it doesn't really matter. It depends in part on who the entrepreneurs are that will respond to the opportunity and what they will produce. Garments, textiles, shoes, and furniture will remain important here. But right now, Bangladesh is developing a shipbuilding industry. Now, that's a labor-intensive industry for relatively small ships, okay? And how did they get to be in the shipbuilding industry? Well, they used to be in the ship breaking up industry. So they were taking ships apart, so they learned how they were fitting together, but they also had parts that they could use to build new ships. And they are producing ocean-going ships. Now, I wouldn't, if you ask me what industries are going to develop in Bangladesh, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would not have come up with shipbuilding, okay? So I may be totally wrong about which industries will develop here in Indonesia, but I think they will be labor intensive and they will be footloose so that they can go anywhere and will go where it is cheaper to produce and not, I mean, one very labor intensive industry is medical care. Yeah, it's very labor intensive, but it's going to take years before Indonesia becomes a center of medical care. Because you don't just need people to clean the hospital and to service it, you also need highly skilled doctors in order to attract patients here. And that takes time to develop. But I think there's a potential, a huge potential here for geriatric care. For older people who need a lot of services, people to push the wheelchair and people to clean you up and feed you and so on. But you also need doctors, otherwise people won't come. And that is not yet developed here. So there is a potential 10 years from now of Indonesia becoming a big country for wealthy people from Asia for elder care.
Question?
Professor, I'm going to ask you about million jobs in agriculture sector, not in manufacture. We know that in Indonesia, most of the poor households are coming from people working in the agricultural sector. And we all know that working in manufacture gives you better wage, gives you better economic condition than in agricultural sector. But we cannot leave the agricultural sector since it is strategic sector in Indonesia. My question is, how can we create million jobs in agricultural sector unless we help them to be connected with another sector like manufacturing sector? Thank you.
One of the problems with the agriculture sector, with getting good jobs in the agriculture sector, is the seasonal employment in agriculture. Yeah. And if any of you have read this study by Gillian Hart of employment in village economies in Indonesia, what it tells you is during the off season, when there is not much work in agriculture, people have a miserable time. Their income goes down. They take work which during other seasons they would not take, such as boiling palm sap to make palm sugar, which is apparently a very miserable job because it's very hot and dirty work. You're covered with stuff at the end of the day. So, and it's very low pay. So people take these jobs in order to survive. So an important thing that can be done, and I think that should be done, is to provide employment during the agricultural off-season through the PNPM program. For those of you who are not familiar with PNPM, it started out as the Kecamatan Development Program in the 1998s and became the PNPN program. It covers all of Indonesia by now, and it provides employment in building rural infrastructure. So it has dual benefits where it is well done. It gives a job during the off season, and it builds infrastructure which increases income in the village permanently. In the past, more than 50% of the money was spent on village roads. So in a village that used to have only a bicycle path now has a road, an all-weather road. So before, it could grow cassava, which you can store and which you can put on a bicycle and take to market. It can now grow tomatoes because a pickup truck can come in, take the tomatoes, bring them to the city, and sell them at a much higher price than the cassava. Or it provides for irrigation, which means that you double or more than double output because irrigated land produces much more than dry land. So the internal average economic rate of return on the KDP program was 72%. And people say that's unbelievable. How can you have a rate of return of 72%? Well, on irrigation, you have a rate of return of over 100%. So you can easily have an average rate of return of 72%. And it provides it covers the gap for agricultural workers. It turns what used to be a 6 months out of the year job into an 8 months or 9 months out of the year job. We have recommended that the program be turned from the current program into a guaranteed employment program. that it guarantees employment to anybody willing to work at the wage which the Pay and Pay-Em program pays. Now, the Pay and Pay-Em program pays a wage that's equal to the agricultural wage in the area. So it is not attractive to anybody except poor agricultural workers who need work during the off-season. That can turn an uncertain agricultural wage into certain income in your village because you're guaranteed employment on the program. Initially, the guarantee might only be for 30 days. Eventually, in India, it's 100 days. You're guaranteed of 100 days of employment. If Indonesia can achieve that, then you can turn a part of the year job into all of the year job, working partly in agriculture, partly in infrastructure construction. I think that would be a major step forward. The second major step forward is to reduce the labor force in agriculture. The fewer the workers, the higher the wage. You know, it's one of the few well-established principles of economics. There are only about 3 or 4 that we all believe in. That the lower the supply, the higher the demand, the higher the wage or the price, right? That it's somewhere the supply and demand influence the price. So the lower the supply of agricultural workers, the higher the demand for agricultural workers, the higher the wage. So we've tried to reducing the supply by getting people out of agriculture into industry, and we're trying to increase the demand by increasing agricultural output. The agricultural workers into better paid workers. But that's going to take a while. You know, the total U.S. labor force engaged in agriculture now is only 4%. It used to be 50%, just like in Indonesia. 50% of the labor force at one time was employed in agriculture. And then it gradually decreased, and now it's 4%, and it's quite well paid. When I was working as an agricultural laborer, I was only paid $18 a month. That's like an Indonesian agricultural laborer. But that was a long time ago. That was in the 1940s. Yeah. But now, if I got another, well, I couldn't get another job, but if I were 15 years old again, I could get a job. I would probably not be getting $18, but $1,800.
Okay. No more question? Oh, still one burning question.
Thank you. Yeah, all of you. My name is Win. I'm from Central Bank. So naturally, I'm interested in your exchange rate suggestion. And personally, I should thank you, given the recent condition, for your mantra that weaker rupiah is a better economic growth. Thank you. Okay. About the exchange rate solution that you suggest, you said that the depreciation will give a better of our economy. And what I want to point out is the effect of the further depreciation in the short term. You know, we are in the floating regime of exchange rate, and we do not have a foreign reserve as huge as China, as big as Malaysia. Right now, it's only about 110 billion US. And so we may not be able to control until which level that the rupiah depreciation for will better off our export and will not damage our domestic consumption. You know that domestic consumption in our economy is still the main factor of our economic growth. And we like to spend on imported goods. Yeah. I think most of our companies also, because we still have stronger domestic consumption, also have more domestic oriented business than the export oriented business. So while your suggestion could be right for the middle term, given that we have deal quite good in this coordination things. You know, it ain't easy to coordinate between 34 ministries, 34 policies, and some 13,000 islands here. Your suggestion could be good for the midterm or long term, but how about the short term? Because yeah, I'm afraid that further rupiah depreciation in this open economy could damage our short-term growth, and in turn could also jeopardize our middle and long-term growth. And maybe second, about the you said that our depreciation could make us take over the China market. Is that right? Yeah, pretty much. And you mentioned our competitors are still Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Laos, Myanmar. And maybe you could share us. I think the how about the level of education in China when they start their industrialization? Maybe in the era of Deng Xiaoping, because maybe we start at that level right now. That's my two questions. Thank you.
First of all, please, devaluation is a powerful tool, but it cannot be the only tool in achieving industrial development in Indonesia. It can be one important tool, but not the only important tool. So, for instance, infrastructure development is at least equally important, but it can be one tool that works quickly in the short term. And I'm not in favor of a quick, massive devaluation in the short term, because that would frighten people. People remember 1998, and they're always worried if the depreciation goes to, say, 13,000, is it going to go to 17,000? And you want to avoid that kind of fear getting hold. So what I have in mind is a process in which is similar to what has taken place in the recent past. Now the exchange rate is 12,000 roughly to the US dollar. So it goes down gradually to 12,200, 250, but then it depreciates a little bit to 12,200. And then it goes down to 12,300, and then it depreciates. And gradually, over time, it keeps getting lower and lower as wages rise in Indonesia in order to keep the dollar wage, the yen wage, the euro wage relatively stable. And what is the target? Well, the target is not any fixed number. What we suggested is the target for the exchange rate should be one that keeps the wage rate in Central Java and the wage rate in Bangladesh close together. So if the minimum wage rises in Central Java more than in Bangladesh, then you have to have more of a devaluation. If Bangladesh is, again, very kind and raises its minimum wage to $90, then you don't need to depreciate the currency. You already have a lower wage then. So you need to do that. You need to look at wages in competing countries. And at the moment, the lowest wage country is Bangladesh. But that could change. Related to the lowest wage in Indonesia, which is in Java. So this is one tool. And it takes not only export, but also competition with imported goods. I don't know if you remember the crisis over nails. I mean, these nails, not these nails. The import of Chinese nails that caused the closure of nail factories. Now, nails are a low-value, high-weight good, right? It costs a lot to transport them because they're heavy, and the value is very low. So you would think that Indonesian nail producers could compete with Chinese nail producers. But about 3 years ago, the factories here were closing down because they could not compete with imported nails. This made no sense. And the factories asked for protection. But it would have been much better to have a small devaluation of the currency that would have made imported nails more expensive and would have protected the factories without distorting the incentives in the economy. So I think it makes much more sense to use the exchange rate than to provide specific protection. And the same problem is going to arise when the ASEAN Common Market goes into effect. There will be, again, many producers in Indonesia who will ask for specific protection because suddenly the protection they've had until now will disappear against imports from the ASEAN Common Market. And now you can deal with that by giving them tariffs, but that will be very difficult because it will be against the rules of the ASEAN Common Market. But there's no rule that says you have to put the exchange rate at any particular point. Indonesia can lower the value of the rupiah, have the same protection, and be entirely legal. So there will be another incentive to either do specific protections or general devaluation to protect the domestic industry from competition with other ASEAN countries. And if Indonesia does not lower the value of the currency, you're going to have a hard time competing in some cases now with Myanmar, which has low labor costs, very low labor costs, Cambodia, and at higher technology, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. So a small devaluation will help with that problem.
Okay. And I wrote down some important points that Professor Papanek was raising. Is the only way to increase income of the poor is by creating jobs with a decent and regular wage, and the importance of labor-intensive manufacture sector for job creation. Also, Indonesia has to reduce cost of production by improving infrastructure and reducing labor costs. Finally, last but not least, devaluation is important tools, but although not the only important tool to lower labor costs. This is very important because many of us still think that value of our currency reflects national pride. Okay, I will stop from then on. Thank you very much, Professor Papanek. Thank you, all of you. Let me also take this opportunity to give time for handing out the books from who's this? Pak Nugroho Winarto, the Executive Director of Transformasi, to the Director of SMERU for our. For the rest of you, ada Mastin, Kabar Gembira. Any of you can get the book down there. Let's.
Keep shaking hands. Keep shaking hands.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lunch is provided, so enjoy your lunch.
Oh, of course. I didn't bring a pen.